All right, so we're going to talk about abortion. A few things before we get started. Go ahead and share my screen. We're going to talk about this in a scientific way, but we're also going to talk about how this has consequences and how this matters. This is a hot button topic. This is a topic that not everybody is going to agree on. I understand that. However, I want to make sure that we're paying attention to what it is we're saying, that we're saying factual to what it is we're saying. So we're going to talk about the scientific statistics. We're going to talk about options. We're going to talk about the statistics on and the variance on support for this and lack of support for this, and we're gonna talk about the nuances, and we're gonna get down into the nitty gritty of this topic. Okay, I again understand that this is a hot button topic, but bear with me, okay, because there's a lot to cover. So we're gonna talk about the feminist pro-choice politics first, because I think that this is a good. Well, actually, let's start with what is abortion, because let's start from the beginning. That makes more sense. RU 486 is a termination medication within 40 days of your last period. It is also technically considered a contraceptive, but it is not. Its goal is not to prevent pregnancy. Its goal is to terminate pregnancy within 49 days from your last period. An induced abortion is the removal of fertilized ovum or fetus from the uterus. So this is the actual extraction of material that is growing. Abortions are at a historical low in the United States. And so that is something that is important to understand in the context of this conversation, that it is already at a historical low. 62% of those abortions are within the first 9 weeks. So within a couple of weeks of finding out you're pregnant, and 90% of those are within the first trimester. So within the first 12 weeks. Generally, pregnancies are not known until between 5 and 8 weeks of gestation, due to the fact that by the time someone misses a period, depending on your cycles, depending on a woman's body, it can take 5 to 8 weeks to really know that you are pregnant, or to really start experiencing any kind of symptoms of that pregnancy either. And not everybody does experience those symptoms. 75% of abortions are of poorer and lower income, or with income below the federal poverty line. The first churches to oppose abortion were the Catholic churches, and they didn't oppose abortion until 1860. Prior to that, abortion was a topic that the church condoned, because it was part of the colonialization and Christian process of taking away personhood of specific cultures and the atrocities that came with religious wars. The first laws didn't appeared in 1821, which was before really churches started their conversation surrounding anti-abortion. So the laws actually came before the churches really started this. So this did not start as a religious argument. The religious morality side of that did not come until almost 40 years later. And that particular ideology, again, coincided with a shift due to the laws and a social norm forming from that law. So that is when the churches started changing their minds. So it wasn't the church changing like the social norms, it was the social norms changing the church, if that makes sense. Only 12% of OBGYN or medical residency programs offer routine training in abortion procedures. So it's a very, very low amount of people who can actually safely do these procedures, and that presents part of the problem as well. So we're going to talk about feminine pro-choice politics. So they believe that abortions are a woman's choice. All pregnancy should be a woman's choice. They should never be forced to have children. That process is also can be very taxing on the body. It is not an easy thing to be pregnant, and so that should obviously be a choice of the woman who has to go through that process. A fertilized ovum should not have the legal or moral rights of personhood. All children should be wanted. So all children that are born should be wanted or have homes that they can go to. Children are expensive, and thus some mothers need social supports that are being increasingly limited. And there are more successful ways to support families that can lead to less need or want for abortions, and those include, whoa, come back. Hold on. Oop. Hold on. Sorry, y'all. Include universal health care, housing and food security, economic security, better funded education systems, comprehensive sex education, accessibility to contraceptives, better supports for women in interpersonal violence, domestic violence, and survivors of sexual violence, including physical measures and support and belief so that they can get out, along with ecological, economic supports for those trying to flee domestic situations so that we have less pregnancies that happen within those contexts. Ecological justice, better parenting provisions in jobs, including maternal or paternal leave, support of the LGBTQ youth and LGBTQ plus families who want to adopt, free college and more widespread educational or job opportunities. Again, that's economic justice, and economic justice allows there to be less of that lower income status, which means that there's less people that physically can't afford to have more children and or can't afford to lose out on time at work for the children that they have or the mouths that they currently have to feed. Higher minimum wage, better, more affordable childcare options, or better social support, including disability expansion. So these are just some ideas on ways to cut down the need or want for abortion, because as people thrive in society, they tend to be more okay with having children. On top of that, understanding that, again, a woman's body goes through a lot when it is pregnant, and that in and of itself can be a deciding factor. Again, remember that some of the reasons for not wanting to be pregnant include medical health issues, and in those circumstances, a pregnancy may be something that could be very detrimental and or risk life for that woman. The battle and current context. So only one part of the reproductive rights conversation is really talked about, and that's abortion, but it's the most discussed, but it's not the only part of reproductive rights. So comprehensive sex education, the contraceptive access to wellness for breast exams, for preventative care, all of these things are part of reproductive justice. But this is the topic that tends to get hit on the most, and it's important to really cover it. But we want to make sure that we also remember that there are other parts of reproductive justice as well. Currently, the Texas ban is that no abortions after 6 weeks, or cardiac activity, which generally happens around 6 weeks. Remember that it takes to around 5 to 8 weeks for a woman to really know that she's pregnant, unless they're actively tracking that and are planning on that happening, in which case generally they're not going to be part of this conversation. It requires 2 visits, one with blood work and one with ultrasounds, and those ultrasounds are pretty much shoved in the face of the person that is getting an abortion. They have to have certain forms of identification to prove they are over the age of 18, no exemptions, period. So even if you're under 18 and you were raped, even in the event of incest, it does not matter. There are no exemptions, and citizens can sue anyone they think has aided in, consulted about, performed, or had an abortion. This would eliminate 85% of the safe abortions done in the state. And again, we can talk about how sexual violence gets tossed into this debate. So one of the main arguments becomes whether or not someone that gets raped should have to carry that baby, and what that means, or carry or should be allotted an abortion for an exceptional case, what the trauma will be of that person. And it gets framed very much as about the entity that's living inside, whether that just be an egg splitting into multiple cells, or that be further along and be more of a fetus. that seems to be the center of that, as opposed to the victim of sexual violence. And that continues to be, they continue to be overlooked and or undercut as part of that conversation. And it's something that we need to be aware of as we try to support and understand survivors of sexual violence. We need to be able to communicate and effectively make them the center of that conversation. And in doing this, when it comes to abortion, that is not the center of that conversation. Their trauma, the things that they have gone through, are not the center. The center becomes that fetus that is growing, or that pre-fetus that is growing inside that human. And again, when you look at this globally, the laws vary very dramatically. These laws and their variants have direct links to unsafe abortions. The more laws or the more restrictive that a country is, the more unsafe abortion happens, and the more deaths happen via unsafe abortions. Accessibility is an incredible concern because it's just not accessible for a wide variety of individuals globally, due to all sorts of different things. A good deal of area offer, again, little to no services. Rural status, socioeconomic status, race, religion, migration status, disability factors, all factors into whether or not you have it, accessibility to these kind of procedures. Note that the rich, the wealthy, and those tied to them will always have access to this, whether or not the lower income statuses do. Prevention, comprehensive health care, and access to contraceptives is also vastly varied depending on where you are globally, and what's allowed. And again, all of that is also dependent on a lot of those statuses. And protection from threats of violence, harassment, and the trauma that can come with getting abortion in any particular space is also something that we need to talk about when we talk about the global picture. So we're going to talk about the pro-lifer movement. They believe in personhood starts at conception. A fertilized ovum and fetus should have all the same legal and moral rights of personhood, that the sanctity of life of the fetus or fertilized ovum outweighs the woman's rights, including the right to life-saving measures. That they can see abortion as murder, though not everyone does. And they claim that doctors and healthcare workers who perform these procedures are accomplices to the crime of murder. Let's see here. The issues in this argument and where legalities tend to come into play are the same people who generally call for less social and medical and education and economic support for families and children are also generally the same that support of banning abortion. And if that's the case, then you're going to have more lower income children that need those medical or need all of those supports that are being limited at every turn. Also, defending and making accessibility issues within social welfare adoptions. So things like creating boundaries or barriers between LGBTQ parents adopting those children. Again, wanting there to be wanting those mothers to, or wanting those women to carry those children and become mothers, but not being able to support those mothers when they economically know they cannot do it on their own, or socially cannot do it on their own, provides a unique situation where the life once born is not always valued in the same way, or the mother's life is not always valued in the same way that the fetus and or the fertilized ovum is. There also is a debate on what point of development does this entity's personhood outweigh the mother's. So at what point in development is, if both lives are on the line, does the mothers come first versus the babies come first, or the fetuses come first, or the ovums come first, and what qualifies that decision, and who gets to make it? Does the law get to make it? Does the doctor get to make it, depending on who's more likely to survive? Does the doctor get to make it based on decision making? If that's a single mom, do we keep the single mom, who is the only source of support for the children that are already born? Do we keep her over the other thing? There's entities here where we're balancing where where there's legal lines that have to be drawn, and those lines don't always accommodate every situation. What responsibility economically or otherwise do fathers have? And would the argument be the same if it were men's bodies and lives hanging in the balance? So if these were life and death situations that came down to a man's life and the baby's, and or we found the scientific process to allow them to carry, would they have to do it? Would we be willing to make law that instead of abortion, if the woman could not carry or was not able to for whatever the reason, then that could be physically transferred to a male's body? Would we do that? And why would we not? Does that sound ludicrous? And why would that sound ludicrous given the social context that we currently live in, right? Think through kind of those processes. There's no evidence showing that bans would stop abortion. Rather, it would make them unsafe. So almost all scientific research shows that banning abortions doesn't actually get rid of them. It just turns them into more unsafe practices and under the table practices, which means that more harm comes of them, more consequences come from them, both socially, economically, and physically and medically. So who is allowed to make medical decisions when it comes to life, one life or the other? So again, are doctors allowed to make that, or are the laws allowed to make that? What is the legal implications of making it in the law's hands when they have no medical background? How does incest, rape, and medically complex mothers, fetuses fit into these arguments? So when it comes to sexual violence, disabled individuals are increasingly at risk for sexual violence. And would someone who is neurodivergent or not capable of understanding what is happening to their body still have to carry that? And what does that mean for that person? And so just really having really hard, concrete conversations about where the lines are, what the lines are, and why those lines are there, and really understanding that there are nuances to this that we can't just ignore. So we're going to talk about Roe v. Wade for just a quick second. It's a 1973 Supreme Court decision. It argues that life began when the fetus can sustain life outside of the mother's body, and without severe medical intervention. So without essentially all the tubes and things doing what a womb would do, without making an artificial womb. The mother's lives can allow abortion at any point in the pregnancy. So the mother's life takes precedence over the fetus's life, no matter where you are in the pregnancy, if it's a life or death situation. It cannot make substantial obstacles getting in the way of abortion. Now, this was based on the articles of the Griswold versus Connecticut, which divided pregnancies into trimesters. That's why we have them, is because a legal law moved them into trimesters to figure out essentially when life began. It's still overwhelmingly supported, which we'll get into. And those attitudes vary depending on numbers of variables, and we'll kind of get into that on the next couple of slides. Chipping away at Roe v. Wade. So it's been chipped away at a lot since 1973. The Hyde Amendment in 1977 gave states the right to prohibit medical funds for abortion. And Harris versus McRae in 1980 ruled that allowed states to deny federal funds for medically necessary abortions. In 1989, Webster versus RH in Missouri prevented public facilities and public employees from assisting with abortions or counseling concerns of abortion if public funds are used. And this really got in the way of being able to have clinics that both did preventative care and also counseled individuals on their rights and their options during pregnancies. In 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey restricted abortion in the following ways. Parental notification was mandatory for those under the age of 18, mandatory counseling and waiting periods. So they had to go through counseling on their options, and they had to go through waiting periods before they could do it after they found out. And they could not use, again, public spending. It refused the refusal clauses, and counseling bans limited women's access in really big ways. And it required an ultrasound imaging that had to go home with the pregnant woman. Military and federal health plans through a law of in Congress also were determined to not support abortion. So if you are in the military and a woman and you get your medical health benefits through any kind of federal health plans, you are not allotted an abortion. In 2003, George W. Bush and his federal abortion ban outlawed the second trimester abortions when even when mother is at risk and or the baby is too malformed to survive outside of the womb. In 2014, George W. Bush, the unborn victims of violence, gave the zygote, embryo, and fetus the same rights as a human. Again, trying to figure out where that line is for whose life is more valued, generally has gone to the fetus as opposed to the mother. In 2018, the Supreme Court upheld the ban on RU 486. The Supreme Court ruled in December that the Texas bill could continue until further hearings on the matter. The fact that it was not immediately struck down allows the law to stay in place for now. This is important to understand. There was some legislation that did help to hold it. In 1994, Madison et al. Versus Women Health Center ruled that it would allow buffer zones around clinics. Freedom of Access to Clinic Interests Act made it illegal to block access and harass or incite violence to those who would enter or exit the clinic. And 7 states have passed Freedom of Choice Acts, which makes Roe v. Wade state law and gets rid of all of the chipping away of those laws. And the debate in graphs. So when we really talk about abortion laws, right? So we talk about things like when push comes to shove, should the decision be made by a doctor if it's a life-saving measure? And really overwhelmingly, that was yes, leave it to the doctor. Should state legislation make it harder for clinics to operate? It's still overwhelmingly that no, states should not be in charge of making it harder to operate. Women should have that choice to go find that entity. And overwhelmingly, Roe is consistently should be upheld, right? So you go down here, Roe should not be overturned. That's 66. It should be upheld by 60. It should be do not overturn by 70, right? So like overwhelmingly, there's still this. Now there's nuances to that, which are how in all cases, in most cases, in which cases should allow this and what have you. But drawing those lines again gets really tricky given the amount of circumstance that could come into play with this. But these are some of the polls and really understanding so that we can understand that primarily those who disagree are the very conservative leaning Republicans, and those tend to be the majority of those who disagree with Roe v. Wade being overturned, but they seem to have some of the loudest voices. Did I go through all of those? Hold on. Let's make sure all of those went through. Okay. Whoa, back one. I knew there was one missing. This is also just some things for your interest, if you're interested. What happens if the abortion laws are restricted? Here is some information on what will happen and how that will affect women. And I can get you that statistic in a bigger graphic if you have a hard time seeing it on here. And this is also talking about the lobbying power of the anti-choice movement. So the pro-life movement and how it really influences with misinformation and what entities are profiting from that, which is an interesting graphic. So real quick, we're going to go into the articles because I want to get through this. Joy is just talking about the reproductive justice model and really having that intersection of race and class. So we're talking about who is the people that are susceptible to state sanctioned violence, and really those become those marginalized statuses. And for what are we talking about? For sterilization, lack of healthcare options, and lack of family planning options. So really diving into kind of some of the other things we've talked about this go. In this one, they really compared several different entities and why reproductive rights as human rights can get tricky and or why it's needed. So in Africa, they're talking about the non-consensual sterilization during the HIV/AIDS crisis, which we talked about in a previous slide. For India, they were talking about securing abortions and how under the guise of this cultural environment where sex-selective abortions are really prominent and where boys really are outweighing females due to the desire to have sons. In Brazil, really talking about restrictive national policies and reproductive rights. So really talking about how reproductive rights have become a very big concern in Brazil, and how unsafe it is and how limited the choice is for women. And then this one talking about really, again, really talking and getting down into those race conversations and how invisible histories of doctors and medical individuals have framed this conversation in ways that have left out voices that need to be heard and have left racial disparities within our healthcare system. And that really also is continued through a lapse of intersectional curriculum in med schools. And just for a tidbit, Medicaid does cover sterilization, but does not cover abortion, which I think is interesting. And really talking about how privilege and power interplay here within the medical framework and why it's important to deconstruct that. The last one is just talking about how the intersection of transnationality and transgender impact health outcomes and really their ability to access proper health care. And so it talks about the growing HIV rates in transgendered communities in the early 90s, and how there was this assumption that individual factors such as sex work, mental health, and substance use were the cause of these things. But then we got into public health issues and really understanding how the social context of health outcomes was really part of this equation, and how understanding systemic community violence really impacts healthcare options. And so they really call for a refocus on health research to adequately cover how society and how social implications impact medical healthcare coverage. So if you have any questions, I know this was a lot. If you really want to get into more of a conversation about anything in these slides, I know, again, this is a hot button topic, but I am perfectly capable of having an adult conversation. If somebody wants to have that or has questions or concerns, please feel free to reach out and contact me, and we can set up something to make that happen. All right, have a good night, and I hope all of you are having a wonderful week.